Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to another National Road Safety Partnership Program webinar. Learning the lessons what 10 years of fatalities data at Toll Group can teach us about road safety. My name is Jerome Karslake and I manage the NRSP and many activities. To find out more, please visit the NRSP website and register for our monthly newsletter, and then you'll be kept up to date of whatever is coming. So, we'll be recording today's session and it will be shared on the NRSP website. Everyone who is registered will be sent an email with a link to the webinar once it's been uploaded. Today's session will go for approximately 60 minutes, 40 minutes presentation with 20 minutes for questions at the end. Just to let you all know, this is a tough topic for our presenter, Dr. Sarah Jones, and by holding the questions to the end, it really will allow Sarah to focus on the presentation first before fielding questions. So, thank you very much for your consideration for Sarah and for Toll Group in sharing what is actually quite a difficult topic for them. That being said, we do love your inputs, so please do send you through any questions you may have. Type them into the question box right here, and we'll grab them as soon as they prompt in your mind. We have plenty of time to explore them at the end, and we certainly don't want you to forget them by missing the opportunity. So, let's move on to our presenter. Our presenter today is Dr. Sarah Jones, General Manager of Road Transport, Safety and Compliance, Health and Safety Environment, Toll Group. Sarah is one of Australia's leading experts in heavy vehicle transport safety, regulation and compliance. She's worked in both public and private sectors across multi-jurisdictions. The environments she's been in have all been very challenging and complex. Prior to joining Toll, Sarah is Director of Compliance and Technology at the National Transport Commission, and she's led such complex areas as fatigue reform. What some of you may not know also is Sarah is also an accomplished author with 3 novels to her name. So we have quite an amazing person with us today. So welcome to you, Sarah, and thank you very much again for sharing your research that you have conducted on behalf of Toll. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Jerome, and welcome to everybody who is listening. Before I start, I would just like to appraise you all of the fact that some of the things I'm going to be touching on today are quite challenging. If you have been affected by death by suicide, please be aware that I will be discussing that. If this raises any issues for you, the lifeline number is 131114. Of course, if you choose to dial out, that is completely understandable. Let me start by providing some contextual information about Toll Group. So Toll is part of Japan Post, and we're the Asia Pacific region's largest provider of logistics services. At Toll, we believe everyone has the right to go home safely, and our objective is to be incident and injury-free. Now, that objective certainly has its challenges in our industry. We work in a dangerous and difficult industry. We have a significant number of compensated fatalities each year when compared to other industries. What you can see here on this graph is our industry performance in terms of lost time injury compared to transport, postal and warehousing industry averages. So comparatively speaking, we perform quite well, but we're certainly not complacent. And as you will hear throughout this presentation, we have vastly more to do. To give you some sense about the scale of our operation, in Australia, we travel a distance equivalent to the moon and back every day. We have more than 2,000 prime movers, 2,400 light vehicles, 11 ships, 10,000 containers, 34 aircraft, 700 sites, and more than 20,000 employees. Let me tell you where the impetus for this research came from. For those of you who may not be in the road transport industry, we are governed by a heavy vehicle national law, which operates in all states except Western Australia and the Northern Territory. In October of last year, that law changed quite significantly. And one of the things it did is introduce a primary duty on all of the parties in the chain. And what that duty requires us to do is to ensure the safety of our transport activity. And one of the ways we can do that is through a deep and forensic understanding of our hazards and risks. Now for us, being involved in road transport, one of the worst things that can happen is that one of our own people or another road user is killed on the road. So we thought a good place to start in coming to that understanding of what our risks are is to investigate every single fatality that we have been involved in over a 10-year period, and then use that data to come to grips with characteristics, patterns and anomalies in the data. And then that would then enable us to put in place sound preventative actions. So I spent a considerable period of time looking at crash investigation material, coroner's reports, police reports, insurance reports, etc., to try and understand the data. The scope of the investigation was as follows. We looked at situations where a toll employee, contractor or casual was killed on a road or road-related area. We looked at situations where a toll employee, contractor or casual was involved in, but not necessarily responsible for, an on-road incident that resulted in a fatality. And we also looked at situations where a toll driver, regardless of employment categorisation, died at a toll premises or in a toll vehicle, regardless of the cause. The scope of the investigation was international, so we looked at all locations from which toll operates. But as you'll hear shortly, the bulk of the fatalities occurred in Australia. So what you can see in slide 8 is a summary graph of all the on-road and driver fatalities that we were involved in. Now, I do need to point out that the 2016-2017 data you can see there is slightly misleading because that is only for a half a year. But what I can tell you is that when extended to a full year, we had 12 fatal incidents with 12 fatalities in that 2016-17 year. So what does this data tell us? We had a total of 147 fatalities arising from 127 incidents. In the worst of those incidents, 4 young people died on a country road in Queensland. To the extent that you can call anything a good news story when we're talking about fatalities, you'll note that our linear trend line is trending downwards. That gives me some level of confidence that the policy initiatives that we're introducing, which you can see plotted there on the y-axis, are having some effect. What you can see in this graph is adjusted data. So in this graph, I removed all of the non-work related incidents and suicides from the data. When looked at it from this perspective, we experienced 97 fatal incidents, resulting in 117 fatalities. The data you can see in this graph is closer to the data you would see in a typical road toll because non-work related and suicides have been removed. You'll note that this graph, compared to the previous one, has a much sharper trajectory in terms of that downwards linear trend. On this graph, you can see the location of our fatalities. And as I foreshadowed earlier, you'll see that the bulk of our fatalities did occur in Australia. We had 101 incidents in Australia, resulting in 119 fatalities. So let me summarise this. Between the 1st of July 2007 and the 31st of December 2016, we had 147 fatalities arising from 127 incidents. When I adjust that data to remove non-work related fatalities and suicides by truck, we had 97 fatal incidents, resulting in 117 fatalities. Now, again, it's difficult to talk about this subject and say that something positive lives within it. But I do think it's really encouraging that when we look at the number of kilometres travelled by our employees, the fatalities per kilometre travelled have improved quite drastically. So that's about a 400% improvement you can see there between 2011 and 2015-16. Now I need to emphasise that is for employee drivers only. There are real methodological difficulties we have in securing all of the data for contractors and casual. So I don't want to overstate this data, but again, it does give me some confidence that the interventions we're pursuing are having some effect. To put this in some context, what you can see here in slide 12 is the Australian road toll. Now, obviously, I'm not comparing apples with apples here for a few reasons. Firstly, my data is international, although the fatalities are concentrated in Australia. And secondly, suicides are removed from the road toll. And I count deaths of drivers on premises and in vehicles, which you won't see in the road toll. The other obvious difference here is around the exposure differential. So your typical Australian light vehicle driver will travel around 15,000 kilometres per year. My long distance professional drivers are driving 14 times more than that. So there's an exposure difference here. But I'll point you to the fact that toll's trajectory is, broadly speaking, mirroring the Australian road toll in that the overall linear trend is downwards. But our trend downwards is sharper. Now, toll is not perfect, and there is a lot more that one can and we must do. But the point here is about analysing the hazards and risks, understanding your data, and interrogating it to ask the question, are we moving in the right direction? Is what we are doing delivering the results we think it is? And that's what I kept coming back to in looking at this data. I want to move on now to sharing with you 6 findings that came out of the interrogation of our data. And the first one is that when you look at who is most likely to be deceased in a fatal incident in which toll is involved in some way, the most vulnerable parties are third-party light vehicle drivers. So you can see in that graph there, 37% of the deceased are car drivers. The second most vulnerable parties are pedestrians at 15%. And that is followed by contractor drivers in work-related situations at 12%. Now, when I look at this material, what I find is that in most cases, the liability lies with the third party rather than with the toll group. And that's consistent with the NTI's findings. So the NTI's 2017 report, when it looked at multi-vehicle fatal accidents, found that the driver of the car or light vehicle was found to be totally responsible in 93% of the incidents. Now again, I'm not comparing apples with apples when it comes to the NTI data. The NTI looks at incidents that had a cost of $50,000 or more from an insurance perspective. So not methodologically identical. But I think it's interesting when you look at how crashes involving trucks can be reported in the mainstream press. There is an inference or an outright declaration or assumption that it will be the truck driver at fault. Our data doesn't support that. And that's led me to ponder the question, are light vehicle drivers sufficiently educated about how to drive safely around trucks? Now, I know when I draw on my own experience, I don't recall that when I got my driver's license, I learned a great deal about how trucks manoeuvre differently to light vehicle drivers. And, you know, I'm embarrassed to admit that many years ago, before I joined the industry, I pulled in front of a truck and was completely puzzled by the truck driver's fairly rude response to that. It was only some time later I came to understand that trucks have a greater stopping distance. They manoeuvre differently. Their blind spots are different. So are we doing enough to educate our light vehicle drivers about that? Out of curiosity, I went and had a look at the New South Wales knowledge test that they use for novice drivers. Now that graphic you can see there is the only question out of a total of 364 potential questions in that test that targets light and heavy vehicle interaction. There are another 2 questions about trucks, but they're about traffic signs related to trucks. So what you're seeing here is the only opportunity out of 364 questions that a novice driver is going to have to test their knowledge about driving safely around a truck. Interestingly, most state and national road safety strategies don't reference truck and car interaction. Are we doing enough in that space? Let me move on now to our second finding. And that was that there is a strong correlation between a fatality and contractors and casual drivers. So what you can see here is that a contractor or casual driver will be involved in a fatality in 69% of cases, as opposed to 29% when it's a toll driver. What does that mean? The first thing to understand is that this isn't a function of greater exposure. So it isn't simply the case that we use more subcontractor drivers and that explains it. That relationship holds when we test it against kilometres travelled. Our subcontractor and casual drivers are killed in work-related fatalities at 3 times the rate of toll drivers. But here's where it gets really complicated. Correlation is not causation. And in this case, I very much hesitate to say the relationship is causal. And one of the reasons for that is that when we look at where liability is found, there's not a huge variation where toll drivers and subcontractor drivers are used. So why does this relationship exist? And I'll be candid with you, I don't have a definitive answer. Is it to do with roads travelled? Is it to do with infrastructure on those roads? Is it to do with differentiated nature of tasks or nature of equipment? or training or understanding of the regulatory and compliance environment? I don't know. What I do know is that I have to come to an understanding of that. And those of you who are listening who are in the road transport industry will know that the obligations of a prime contractor in the law are identical to the obligations of an employer. So there's no difference. I have to untangle what is going on here. Now we have had for some time a subcontractor management system. And what that system does is the subcontractor wants to do work with toll. We have a pre-qualification system where we seek to ensure that the subcontractor is safe and compliant and has values that align with our own. We also have an audit and assurance program whereby we conduct audits of subcontractors to test that that is in place. But one of the more recent things we've introduced are subcontractor forums for our line haul subbies. And during these forums, which are held in major cities and regional centres, we invite our subcontractors in those regions to come spend a day with us, and we talk through our safety trends. We talk through hazards and risks that we're finding and how they can be prevented. We refresh on toll policies and procedures, and we take great pride in giving subcontractors access to information that they perhaps otherwise wouldn't be able to access. So among our guest speakers, we've had Chief Inspector Phil Brooks of the New South Wales Police and Mike Robertson of Logistics, as well as senior representatives from the regulators. So it's an opportunity for our subcontractors to ask questions and get the latest information from recognised experts in the field. So we're trying to put this greater emphasis on education, information and upskilling. Let me move on to our third finding. What we found was that non-work related fatalities occurred in about 9% of our incidents. And these are overwhelmingly the result of a heart attack experienced on a toll premises or in a toll vehicle. Now, this is pretty consistent with other research in the area. What you can see there is a quote from a Newark study done in August 2003. But I'll point you to the fact that, as the researchers said, many drivers have no prior knowledge of the presence of a cardiovascular condition. Now, how can that be? In trying to come to grips with what might account for that, we went back and we had a look at assessing fitness to drive and what that has to say about cardiovascular health. Now, it's pretty interesting that health assessments based on AFTD rely largely on self-report to identify risks of heart disease and existing heart disease. So the current assessment doesn't include screening for diabetes or hyperlipidemia, and it doesn't include an ECG. In other words, there's a big question mark about how predictive assessing fitness to drive is about cardiovascular health. I also think it's quite interesting that AFTD is interested in the physical capacity of the driver at that moment in time to drive. It doesn't really ask questions about the inherent requirements of the task. So it doesn't look at functional capacity around loading, unloading, restraining freight, etc. This puzzles me somewhat. Fitness for duty standards exist in rail, they exist in maritime, and they exist in aviation. Why do they not exist for road transport? This is a real puzzler for Toll Group because we have ship captains, we have pilots, and we have road transport drivers. Why is their health approached so differently? This led us in 2017 to start the development of a fitness for duty standard at Toll Group. So we've been working closely with medical consultants in that space and are very close to a final product. I'm going to move on now to our findings about suicide by truck. Again, I do need to emphasise that if this is an issue for you, if you've been touched by death by suicide, please feel free to dial out now. If it does raise any issues for you, I strongly encourage you to contact Lifeline at the conclusion of this call. So what is suicide by truck? We've defined it as where a third party intentionally places themselves in the truck's path and is confirmed as suicidally ideated by the coroner, the police, or the insurer. In 14% of our fatalities, they were confirmed suicide by truck. Of those, most were pedestrians who walked into the path of the truck. 32% were light vehicle drivers who veered into the path of the truck, and in one instance, it was a motorcyclist. That figure of 14% is almost certainly an underestimate. The reason for that is that coroners' courts tend to make a presumption against suicide. There's also quite good evidence that an individual who is suicidally ideated might deliberately choose vehicular suicide because it's more likely to look like an accident, and thereby it saves the decedent's family from the stigma of suicide. If I base my estimate on the testimony of my drivers, it is closer to 20% of the fatalities with which we are involved. So just pause for a moment to take that in. That up to 1 in 5 of the fatalities with which toll is involved on a road are suicide by truck. When I first uncovered this statistic, I found it improbable. I had heard stories from drivers about this phenomenon, but my information was entirely anecdotal. And there's not a huge amount of information available about vehicular suicide. But what I did find was a study conducted by the Department of Vehicle Safety at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden. And when they looked at 379 fatal crashes involving trucks, they found that 17% was suicide by truck. I then approached the NTI, who have really excellent data, and asked them to interrogate their multi-vehicle fatal crashes in 2017. They advised me that 37.5% of those fatal crashes were either indicated or strongly indicated as suicide, with nearly 21% being strongly indicated. Given that, I have some confidence that our figure of 1 in 5 is about right. The question we then have to ask is, what impact is this having on our drivers? To have unwittingly been the instrument by which another human being chooses to end their lives. Not only that, our drivers are usually the first responder on scene. The obvious hazard, the risk here, is post-traumatic stress disorder. I'd like to read you a quote from our senior chaplain who works with drivers impacted by suicide by truck. She said the following: while not all people affected following an incident go on to receive a formal diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, the signs associated with this condition and the symptoms experienced by the employee would imply this is the case. Intrusive memories, flashbacks, situational avoidance, sleeplessness, irritability, mood changes, sense of self-blame, and other conditions associated with PTSD are all described in discussion with drivers' families and other affected employees. Until now, suicide by truck has been a largely unacknowledged and under-researched phenomenon. Suicides are removed from the road toll and they're not separately reported. It's very difficult to have a conversation when something is absented from the record. Now, why is it absented? Fundamentally, it is because we have a philosophy that road safety incidents are preventable. But of course, vehicular suicide completely subverts that idea, because the individual who is suicidally ideated at that moment in time is very deliberate in their intent. They want the incident to occur. And this notion just doesn't exist in our current philosophical paradigm about road safety. It's caused a real conundrum for toll group, beyond the obvious emotional distress of this topic. And I can tell you, as someone who was reading coroner's reports, there were days when doing this research that I was at my desk in tears. Beyond that, how can toll solve this problem unilaterally? This is a community and a mental health issue. We aim to be incident and injury free, but how can we achieve that when we're grappling with this kind of problem? The second issue we have is something called the Werther effect. And what that is that if we speak about suicide by truck in a way that is irresponsible or insensitive, we actually create a risk of contagion. We could make this problem worse. But if we don't talk about it, we're not serving our drivers, and we're not educating the public and government and road safety bodies about a very real issue on our roads. So what we have done is we looked to rail. So the rail industry has had a long history with suicides on rail, and they've done a lot of research. We approached TrackSafe, which is a registered charity launched in 2012, and we've now entered into a formal partnership with them, as they have very well researched, highly credentialed materials for trauma management programs. And we're in the process of adapting those programs for our own people. We're really looking at two things there. One is we're looking to be more candid with our drivers that suicide by truck is an occupational hazard. And if it's something you experience, we want to be upfront with people about what their responses might be. And the second component is for people who have experienced it, we want to have the best-in-class psychological and wellbeing interventions. Let me move on. The fifth finding was that 23% of all the fatalities either occurred during a window of circadian low or fatigue was a causal factor. So we're talking here about incidents between midnight and 5 a.m. That won't be a surprise to most of you. That's pretty consistent with the data in the industry. You can see there I've reproduced Narelle Howard's stats of contributing to 20% of truck-involved fatal crashes. The NTI attribute about 12.2% of losses to fatigue. Finding 6 is a fairly interesting one. This is what we didn't find. So I found no systemic evidence of drug or alcohol use in these fatalities. In fact, the only instances where that was reported, it was the third-party driver who was impaired. Surprisingly, speeding, distraction, equipment and mechanical failure didn't feature terribly heavily. Now, I must say, I don't want to overemphasise this terribly much. The reason being that there is a difference in quality, completeness and comprehensiveness of some of the reports, some of the investigation findings I was working with. But yeah, I do think that that's fairly interesting. I expected to see certainly more speeding and more evidence of distraction than I did. So let me make some closing remarks. For any of you who are listening who are in the heavy vehicle industry and you're pondering what 36C and executive officer liability means for you, interrogating your data is a really useful place to start. When I started this project, I had, I guess, some expectations, but I was surprised when I forensically worked my way through it at what we found. And those findings have better positioned us to be more preventative and more targeted in our approach. The second observation I would make is that industry has valuable insights and really should have a seat at the policy and regulatory table. And this is not in any way to disparage the contribution of academics, road safety professionals and government. It is simply to make the point that industry has vital information and should be included. The perception of trucks being at fault is not borne out by our data. And I think there is really more that needs to be done around education on how to share the road safely. Clearly, Toll has work to do on subcontractor management and education, and that's an ongoing project for us. We need cross-sectoral collaboration to tackle how to share the road safely. Toll can't do this unilaterally. If fitness for duty standards are required in aviation, in rail and in maritime, why should road transport be different? Why should the health and safety of truck drivers be different? Vehicular suicide is hidden, and so it is not receiving an adequate policy response at this time. Again, an issue that Toll cannot resolve unilaterally, but that we need to tackle. And finally, and unsurprisingly, fatigue and driving in the window of circadian low remains a risk and remains something that we are very attentive to. I thank you greatly for your attention. I hope there's been some material in our research that you can use, that set you to thinking, and I very much welcome your questions and even more than that, your suggestions. How are we going to solve this road safety beast? Over to you, Jerome.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. And look, I'll just open up first of all with a comment straight away from Tony here. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of feedback from the audience. Tony says that was the most interesting and thought-provocative webinar I've ever attended. So thank you, Tony, for that, and thank you, Sarah.
Tony, you just made my day. Thank you very much for that.
I know, it's always a good way to begin, isn't it? And we have a large number of questions, very diverse. So we'll open up this one here from Keith. Sarah, why did you not include serious risk or near-miss instances as well?
I guess it was a hierarchy of risk approach. So I started with fatalities, but that is an excellent point, and that will probably be my next research frontier.
I guess that's going to be another enormous one you'll be opening up right there.
Yes, watch this space.
Question here from Hans. He asks, in 2008, 09 and 13, 14 data, years, were they reflective of reduced business activity or something else where you had the lower?
Interesting question. I think that would be part of it, yes. We'll certainly be seeing the impact of the GFC, but I think we should also bear in mind that 2008 saw the introduction of the heavy vehicle driver fatigue reform. So I would speculate that that would also have something to do with it.
It's always difficult to look respectively like that. Clint here asks, on one of the earlier slides, it showed a notable drop in fatalities after the introduction of speed monitoring. Then the numbers spiked up again in the years after. Can you provide more insights to this, please?
Yeah, great question. So, yes, we did see a significant drop-off, and I actually have another graph that I didn't use, which shows how the introduction of speed monitoring on our vehicles led to a significant drop in speed incidents. There was clearly a causal relationship between the introduction of the technology and the drop in the number of speed incidents we had. Now, I do need to point out, we never had a high number of critical speeding incidents. Most of our speeding incidents were moderate, and that's where we saw the radical drop. What I suspect the relationship might be, and why the graph is jagged, is initially we introduced speed monitoring for vehicles 12 tonne and above, and it was only 2018 that we moved to vehicles 4.5 tonne and above. So we're kind of dealing with a slightly different population.
Thank you very much. Question here from, a bit of a comment / question here from Keith. Correlation with contractor and casual drivers. Could you compile a heat map of crash locations of both groups and see whether there's a causal relationship? It's just a suggestion he makes.
That is a really great idea, Keith. I think I'm going to do that.
Well, you never know where they come from. It's a great opportunity. And I'll follow up with another one.
Yeah.
Go, Sarah.
Sorry, and I just want to make the point, these are precisely the kinds of suggestions I'm looking to the audience for, because obviously I need to understand that relationship better. Something's going on there. I don't know what it is, but any suggestions about what I should be investigating are very welcome. So I'm making a note of that.
I love seeing a good outcome. Question here from Michelle. Do you think sleep apnea should also be included in fitness to drive assessments? And what will we do with the knowledge when we have it?
Do I think sleep apnea should be included? Yes, I do. What do we do with the knowledge when we have it? Well, I am not a medical doctor, so I'm not going to pretend to a deep and fulsome understanding of sleep apnea. But it's my understanding that it's quite treatable. So once we have the information I think you would approach it as any other hazard or risk. You know about it, you seek the best intervention, you deploy it.
Excellent. Question here from Kurt. How difficult was it to get your management team to talk about fatalities and suicide?
I have been extremely fortunate, I have to say, at Toll Group in that this was information that my executive team wanted to know. So there was no fudging, there was no euphemisms. It was lay it out on the table and tell us what it means. And I mean, you listened to me talk for the past 45 minutes. You'd appreciate some of this information. It's sensitive and it's difficult and, frankly, unpleasant. But I've found our management team, they want to know, because having the empirical data, having the understanding is the beginning of changing it. What I think has been most challenging for us is around the suicide by truck piece. The last thing you want to do is create a contagion effect, and that's something I do really worry about. And I worry about creating more trauma for my drivers by talking about it, by giving it a public forum, and in effect forcing them to relive it. And this is something I've really grappled with, but I have concluded that if we want to be incident and injury free, and we do, we have to confront this in the way that we confront everything else. But I will say, I understand that not every organisation has the culture where it's possible to be radically transparent. And I think at Toll, and again, we are not perfect, I'm not suggesting we are, but I feel fortunate that I've had that environment where I can be radically transparent.
You're very lucky there, Sarah.
Yes.
Question here, because we've got a bit of a theme around the light vehicle driver education. A couple of people come in agreeing and saying there's quite an educational oversight with regards to driver education. A point one's asking here is, who would you see as responsible for educating the general road user about trucks?
Great question. I think it's everyone. Industry definitely has a role to play. The ATA has a wonderful initiative called the Safety Truck, and the Safety Truck targets individuals between 16 and 25 years old, goes to high schools, colleges, etc., and gives young people an opportunity to familiarise themselves with a truck, to understand how it manoeuvres differently and get an understanding of how they need to adapt their behaviour on the road when they're next to a truck. So industry definitely has a role, and I don't want to underplay that. But I think certainly government, I think, looking at the education we give novice drivers in knowledge tests is a pretty obvious place to start. I was kind of shocked that when I went looking at the New South Wales test, that of nearly 400 questions, you've got one that's about truck and light vehicle. I think road safety bodies. I think it's all of it.
It's the old adage of the shared responsibility. We all have a role to play.
Definitely.
We've got some questions here just drawing on a little bit more information around the data. So Hans is asking, do you look at the geographic distribution of fatalities, where it's concentrated, dispersed, where there are hotspots? And I've got another one down here asking whether there's a difference between line haul and urban operations.
So in answer to the first question, broadly speaking, yes, I have a geographical breakdown in that I looked at the data from a state and territory perspective and the nature of the road. I didn't go much beyond that. So I think there's more to be found. And in answer to the second question, no, this data doesn't speak to that. But I think that's where, I think it was Keith or Hans made the suggestion about looking at near misses and incidents that are non-fatal, because obviously that's going to be a larger data pool that I can look at. So, you know, I really like that suggestion of making that the next research frontier. And then I'll be able to come back to you with the answer.
It'll also be interesting to see if there's certain hotspots, if it is happening, whether it could also be the road infrastructure that's causing it as well.
Look, absolutely, it's possible. I'm a great advocate for the need for more and better heavy vehicle rest stops for drivers. So I think, you know, that's a key infrastructure question.
Sarah, Sean's got a question here. 23% of fatigue-related fatalities. What percentage involve truck drivers versus third parties?
Well, again, in that data, the liability is generally found to be with the third party. So it's the fatigue and tiredness of the car driver. And when you think about it, that's probably not so surprising, in that we've done so much, I think, as an industry and certainly at Toll, to educate drivers about impairment by fatigue. We have pretty strict rules about work and rest. At Toll, we use technology like driver state sensing technology to check for evidence of microsleep in real time. Do light vehicle drivers do the same? Do they have the same understanding about circadian rhythms? I sincerely doubt it.
I'll say one thing, we have an enormous number of questions, Sarah, so we're not running out at all. I'll let you know that. Question here from Dave. It said, thank you very much for the prezzo. He noted fatigue was associated, so it's just drawing on that previous thread, in a high number of instances. How successful have you been with your fatigue monitoring equipment?
So what I can tell you is that we had our first pilot using a DSS at German Creek. I think it was around about 2011, 2012. And we saw a rapid reduction in evidence of impairment by fatigue. Now, I choose my words there very carefully because, as you'd be well aware, fatigue, unlike speeding or blood alcohol concentration, there's no test for it. You can't blow in a bag and be told you are at X on a scale of impairment by fatigue. So what DSS does is check for evidence of microsleep or impending microsleep, which then prompts an intervention. So our experience with that to date has been positive. It has yielded results. We have had some issues with false positives, which does create a strain for the driver, but we're working that through.
A question here from Sue. Regarding the subcontractor question, are your subcontractors inducted and trained the same way as your own employees, or is there a bit of a hangback or distance between how they're treated?
So, yeah, difficult question to answer, Sue. But certainly, they're inducted into the Toll way of doing things. So we have our own specific procedures around things like trailer coupling. We have a way of doing that is a Toll way, which might not be the way that people have been trained at other sites or for other companies. But we've concluded this is the least risky way, the safest way, and this is the way we want people to do it. So, yeah, we do have our own industry standards, and induct subbies. Do we have more to do? Yes. Yes, we do.
Thank you very much. Back to the sort of near-miss sort of question. How are you happy with the near-miss reporting that you have in place? Or do you think that the research you've done will be leading to sort of improving and tightening them now? So I've got a few sitting around that sort of question.
Look, as you know, I didn't look at near misses, and I hesitate to give a definitive answer. What I will say is that my sense is that our reporting culture is pretty good. I think over the last 2 years, there's been a real push on, if it happens, report it. And a cultural emphasis on you're not going to get in trouble for the incident. You know, the issues are going to arise if you're not transparent about the incident and you don't report it. And this has been driven from the very top. So our Managing Director, Michael Byrne, he is personally advised of every single significant safety incident we have. And I can tell you he reads everything. He has questions about every incident. And for me in my role, I have to say that's been incredibly enabling, because you can then say to your colleagues, and peers who might place a different emphasis on parts of their work, you're able to say, hey, if our managing director, an incredibly busy man, can prioritise this and ask questions about this, so can you. So I really feel that culture of reporting, it comes from the top.
Thank you. Last question, and I do apologise, there are absolutely so many. I've been busy scrolling through trying to get a mix of everything. When you're looking at non-logbook, did you look at non-logbook related work? What happened before driving or during breaks when measuring the true impacts of fatigue? So have you gone above and beyond outside just fatigue instances?
No, I don't have that.
No worries.
If I were to do all of these wonderful suggestions that are coming through, I'd probably do little else than interrogate this data for the next year.
I think you've been doing an amazing job. So I do apologise that I've sort of run out of time to ask questions, but I guess just the last closing one, Sarah. Would you like to make a sort of a closing final sort of comment that you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Look, I'm really heartened that so many of you called in and had an interest in this space. Encourage you to get in touch with me if you have any suggestions. Certainly don't pretend to have all the answers, and as you would have gathered, I have more questions than answers. But I think we're stronger. We're stronger if we combine our knowledge and we combine our efforts rather than sit in our silos. And I know there's a temptation to do that when we're all in business and in competition with each other, but I'm sure every single one of us wants to see the road toll go down.
Excellent. It's a great sort of closing comment. And once again, to all the people who sat in, I've got like another sort of 40 questions here which I haven't got through, which shows you the interest that you've generated, Sarah. Thank you very much for your time.
It's my pleasure, and thank you everyone for dialing in.
And thank you very much to our audience. So please do keep up to date with our news. Visit the NRSUP website, register for our newsletter, and you'll be kept abreast as to what's coming up. Next month, we have one around gross vehicle mass, axle mass with regards to light vehicles with an expert from Impetus Suspension joining us. So please take your time, come along and join us for that one. Thank you all again. There's a lot of comments that have come through thanking Sarah for a great presentation and sharing the information. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to hopefully having you as part of a future NRSUP webinar.